Hi, I'm Larissa Shaw. I'm an art handler, and I'm an artist, a researcher, and an educator. I co-direct Freehouse and Freehouse Crit Club. There's lots about my practice that functions as research, and I'd like to talk a little bit um, how each of these things have led me to this PhD and enabled me to be a researcher for the PhD. I'll start the presentation by exploring what I do, the different aspects of what I do, and how this reflects or contributes to my M4C proposal and my PhD research. Um, I'll also talk about how different aspects of this, like my career as an artist, will be some of my methods for carrying out all my PhD research. So this is some of the work that I have installed as an art handler. On the left, this is a gallery in London. This was Jeffrey Gibson's work this year. It's a private gallery, so some of what I do is not just in public galleries, but it's also for private galleries, private companies as well. On the right here, Rashid Johnson's exhibition at Moderna Museet in Stockholm. I do work kind of like all over Europe, although it's mainly um, in England. I get to see a lot of different stuff and gain inspiration from that. Here is an exhibition that I installed. I built the space as well. This was Imagining Otherwise at Primary. The artists are Jaslyn Kaur, Ashley Holmes, and Yala Wahid. Um, Again, on the left, Sheila Kamani Singh Burman at Compton Burney this year, and on the right, Fountain Sculpture in the gallery. Next is Jonathan Baldock's work. I really had a lot of fun installing this exhibition. I like to see lots of different types of exhibitions as well. This is at Yorkshire Sculpture Park. I also like working with artists who are like in the process of establishing, not just established artists. So, for example, Luke Routledge's work on the left at Icon, which is still on, and on the right, Reflector, which is a group exhibition at the New Art Gallery Walsall. These are emerging um, photographers, this exhibition, 15 new photographers. Also, what I do is exhibition builds. So on the right, I kind of designed and built um, Vivid Projects new space. And on the left, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery 2024. That exhibition's open, so I do everything from kind of like the design of the exhibition to building it, doing all the carpentry aspects of it, and then installing artwork as well. I enjoy having all of those different aspects about my art handling and gallery technician career. Something I really enjoy and I feel excited by is sharing space with people. This generally accumulates by me coming together with other artists to make physical spaces. So, for example, in Freehouse, I'm generally the initiator of these spaces, and then I'll kind of like dilute myself in a group of artists that want to join the space. I do this because I enjoy conversations and listening to people's ideas. Um, so at Freehouse is an artist cooperative space who organises studios in a small gallery space. It's on Fraser Street in Digbeth. Myself and Dinosaur Kilby started this space in May 2023 over mutual agreement that Birmingham needed more studios and a gallery space for artists. Since then, we've been really full with studio holders. We've had a class from RCA coming to visit us, organised by their lecturer, who found us on Instagram. We've had Paradise Works visit us, who are a larger artist studio complex from Manchester, who were also started under similar ethos to us, and that was needing more spaces for artists in the city. Out of Freehouse, I started to initiate an artist critique group called Freehouse Crit Group. I like doing crits with the students I taught at Margaret Street, and I reflected how much I benefited from crits at art school, both on my undergrad and my postgrad. One week we had 15 people turn up to the crit, which if you've ever been to Free House, like you'll know it's a really small and unheated space and it doesn't have stairs or a lift. So it really became my priority to make accessibility central to this activity. We currently run meetings out of Pan Pan in Birmingham, and our next meeting in 2 weeks will be at Vivid. I kind of also offered a space in March and the New Art Gallery Warsaw in April. I liked having this idea of moving around different galleries in the West Midlands, having conversations that were shaped by the environment according to whether the gallery has a library or a communal space or what exhibitions are on at that time or what member of staff greets us. I'll sort of explore this more about moving around and visiting spaces and talking to a group later on because that's obviously relates to my proposal. Prior to the crit group of Free House, me and another artist, Tommy, set up Matters of Interest in 2020, which was an online artist group that met through video calls bi-weekly. Tom and I knew each other from Margaret Street, both being on our MA Arts and Education practices. My MA research at that time, and still does, 5 years on, themes around Walton and Benjamin's uh, convolutes from his unfinished work, the Arcades Project. Convolutes are assemblages of different matters, of artifact sounds, web installations that feed into one subcontext. It's important these ideas are displayed together and to communicate complex or convoluted ideas. So, in terms of thinking back to how this might manifest in my PhD research, is that I've had this kind of like solo um, time of working in archives, gathering all of this research, and then displaying that in some way, whether that's in response to a group of people or it's just an exhibition of what I found. I think that's to be figured out during the PhD. Um, so yeah, something that comes up a lot in my practice is like it includes a time where I go and do solo research. I guess I'll interview people, I'll um, do archive visits and kind of like do lone study. And then once I've done that, I'm very much like curious to how people bounce back from that, how people respond. And I'm also interested in bringing people into exhibitions and seeing their responses, especially for people that are like not from an arts background. Um, so with matters of interest, we'd individually and collaboratively prepare interactive online content and would invite artists and other teachers to do talks as well. Um, so for this example, I made a Padlet, which is like an online whiteboard where you can record and audio and videos, take photos, share links, and so on. You'd see the ideas happening live where people would delete and they'd post and add in and editing and re-uploading. I think if that project was to happen now and it's obviously not locked down, then these would be happening in real life. But because we were restricted to, you know, being in confinement, um, we did as much as we could online and we would kind of like visit exhibitions virtually and see how people respond that way. I was really interested to see like 20 people come to one of my sessions on the Padlet activity. Um, and we'd only like really shared what we were doing through our Instagrams and through Big Shop Friday, which is an organisation in Milton Keynes, who became interested in what we're doing after seeing us online, and they started sharing us in our sessions too. Um, we had like over 200 attendees in total, ranging from as close as fellow Brummies to Latvia and then to New York and then all over Europe. So it was really interesting to see how the group grew just through word of mouth and through common interest. And I think that's something that I can definitely take forward to the PhD, knowing that there's that point of interest for people, particularly when it's an emotional or a physical response to something, that people are keen to share their experiences of it. So we ran until 2023, which was around the time I started Freehouse. So we had a little finale exhibition with Black Hole Club, which was an in-person version of the session I ran on connecting the commons, the Padlet activity. Members of the public dropped in from Dig the First Friday. They were sort of invited to even talk in a circle group or about access or inaccess to art, particularly like we spoke about the spaces that should adopt to invite non-artists to attend. So imagining this inclusive space where I was really starting to think about institutional attitudes and what it is to be better understanding and how to bring in a wider audience in. Something I really tried to do with this is through workshops I led, particularly with British Art Show Nine's Artist in Schools programme. I was placed in five different high schools around the Black Country and developed five separate workshops with each school. I decided to, with each school, we'd explore a different artwork. So I'd specifically like to talk about this one that I did with a school where I was there 2 half days a week for 6 weeks, which I think is a good amount of time to really like develop a rapport with someone. This school was predominantly 13 to 16-year-olds with additional learning needs. They were children with English as a second or additional language. And they mostly had never been to an art exhibition before. So that was really interesting for me to be part of that journey with them. As a group, we went to British Art So Nine exhibition and they chose Grace Doritu's work to respond to. This is Grace's work that we saw. The group specifically liked the protest signs and how they're reflected in the fabric of the costumes. I'll just go back to the last slide of the students' work. So the conversations with the group explored themes of belonging and home. Many of the students had been born in their home country and said that they wished their school allowed them to adopt more cultural customs from their home into the school. Two of the students were wheelchair users, and they said that they'd wished other students were more aware of what it would like to be a wheelchair user and to try and navigate a school with so many sets of double doors, some that had like faulty or not so responding, not so responsive automatic open functions on it. So our third time to the school, the students said that they decided they wanted to do a fashion show that fails. And I really loved this idea. So we set about to design and make clothes that had a really long arms that were you could trip up on them, or they had really wide shoulder pads so you couldn't fit through the door. So this idea of using art as a tool to create a vehicle to have some really difficult questions and responses in also became about like having fun together and taking one idea into something that was set about a statement. Again, this is something that I'll come back to later with regards to, the workshops and using that as a vehicle to have some difficult conversations. What happens in workshops is generally unknown to me until we start having conversations together. Someone from a school or a university or a gallery um, will ask me to come and do a workshop, and I'll choose the media, like if it's going to be textiles or making zines or printing onto tote bags, or if it's collaborative writing on Google Docs. But that's it. Um, I'll bring in a load of exhibition flyers from the galleries I've visited or worked recently to start. a conversation, and then the conversation turns into something important, and then we start making something together. It becomes this really special thing that it's completely specific to that time and that group of people. So sometimes we'll go into the galleries and I'll ask uh, a task for them to do. I'll tell them a task to do, and then like starting at an art, staring at an artwork for like 2 minutes, and then saying the first word that comes into our minds, and their individual theme for their zine that we'll work on will be that word that they've said. So sometimes really difficult topics do come up, but witnessing people express themselves through art, especially when it might be something they're not used to, can be like really impactful on that individual's life in a positive way. It gives them the emotional tools to perhaps discuss those things with the group or a trusted friend or family member and begin to like articulate their emotions, thoughts, and feelings. Um, yeah. So something that I had an idea about with my PhD research is maybe we would visit as a group the Healing Words exhibition. This is obviously metaphorical. Is it metaphor? Is that the word? That's I'm talking about like if the project was now, this exhibition will be over, but there's going to be like another thing or another aspect of it. This is just an example of how I see a group and me accessing an exhibition together or an archive together. So Healing Words is an exhibition on collaborative, uh, almost like recipe books that functioned as handwritten household manuals prior to the 50s. That's the 1950s. Produced mainly by women from rural communities. The recipes contain information on medical and herbal remedies from plant botany, concoctions using household items, and these were components that may be found in the home or perhaps immediate environment around the home. What could be a topic of interest in this group that I'm proposing that we go and visit this exhibition is how we conduct like the future workshops. So, for example, these manuscripts demonstrate like a really wide and rich context of legitimate but unofficial medical information, sharing on how medicine was understood and practiced at community level, um, prior doctor as well, prior to the professionalization of becoming a doctor and seeing a doctor. So I'm really interested in ethically responding to participants' needs. And I always do when conducting workshops with a group, in instances of British Art Show, 9 workshops, icon youth programs, and so on. Um, I think this ability that I have to be responsive to needs of a group will enable me to address my aim of my research, um, which is um, to mitigate uh, and imagine previously ab previously absent histories to document lived experiences. So being reflexive in my participants' needs means I won't have some idea of what it could be. It's completely reflexive to that individual or those groups. So it could turn out to be a podcast or a group exhibition or perhaps even a model for a space like a places of work, education, and healthcare to implement. The research is really about being responsive to whoever I'm sharing space with at that time. So that kind of brings me to um, the context of my research so that we can begin to like unpack why this research is needed, why it's needed at a particular time, as well as why at BCU and UOB and Uni of Nottingham. Okay, so be prepared. This is a wild one. Um, it's kind of like it is statistical that endometriosis currently takes 8 years to be diagnosed, although I personally was like 15 years, and my own diagnosis only came like in 2023. The delayed diagnosis could be for a number of reasons, but research shows that for the first 2 to 3 years, the women and those assigned female at birth are societally shamed to talk about their menstrual health, and they're too embarrassed to see a doctor about it. So women are unaware what fits outside the remit of what a normal period is because there's not many environments to kind of like have these discussions. There's no environments that are welcoming or encouraging of it. And then the first 5 to 6 years following that, hesitancy to see a doctor, are due to symptoms not being heard by their doctors, not being referred, having their symptoms minimized, diminished, disbelieved before being finally possibly referred. Um, so endo was named in like the 1920s, but the symptoms of endometriosis had become were documented in medical literature for millennia since 1825 BCE. I found this out through a podcast I've been listening to recently. And that's in the Egyptian text, Cahun gynecology, gynekin, gynecological papyrus, or papyrus. I don't know. Sorry. Um, And what is evident through like the beginning of time really is that symptoms were really pathologized as being expressions of emotional distress rather than actual physical issues, something radiated throughout the whole of the European witch hunts and into the 19th century in times of like female hysteria. This was a time when women complaining of pain and symptoms of endometriosis were treated by being accused of being hysteric or mad. They were admitted to asylums and, had to have really aggressive surgeries, including removal of ovaries, hysterectomies, and even lobotomies. The case of hysterectomies is still actually being used wrongly in treating endometriosis. This is one of my references, Leah Hazard, titled Womb. By point of surgery, often a person with endometriosis will have stage 3 or 4, um, before being finally taken seriously and referred to surgery. I say wrongful treatment of hysterectomy here in cases where the lesions have gone beyond the womb and the pelvic floor cavity, and attached to other organs, and the lesions go on to grow further spread. So any removal of the reproductive organs is kind of redundant because the disease is on other organs now, kidneys, diaphragm, bottom of your lungs, bowels. So, you can't have all of your internal organs removed. So, I'm kind of interested in like this historic reiteration of misinformation that seems to be permeant through like the medical world. So like in reflection of the rhetorics of hysteria, I think this feeling about women and it being more physiological than actual physical cause like persists today. We see so many women are frequently dismissed as being neurotic, anxious, or hypochondriac when they first mention symptoms of endo, um, you know, being diagnosed, and doctors around them will tell them this is, inevitable consequence of being a woman. That's something that I heard, that's something I was told. Also my mom too, throughout her whole menstrual life, from puberty to menopause, which is 40 years. This sort of misformed oral rhetoric even made its way down to me, a 13-year-old who was experiencing chronic pain. My mom was diagnosed with stage 4 endometriosis shortly after she went through menopause at the age of 55. And that was unrelated. That was through surgery through fibroids. And then shortly after, I received my diagnosis at the age of 28, which was stage 3, after taking a loan to pay privately. There was all sorts of mishaps that I kind of experienced and I shouldn't have. Prior to going private in 2023, I was told like to have a baby and this would cure my endometriosis. There is no evidence to suggest in any way that this is true. I did look back kind of in time about where this kind of story or misinformation came from. And I found it to be a doctor called Joe Meager, Meage. He was and still is like a really influential American gynecologist. I mean, he's dead, but the literature is obviously permeating because I'm being told to have a baby to cure my endometriosis. And this was from a public lecture in the 30s where he announced that endo was a disease that you mainly see in white, wealthy women who delayed marriage and childbearing due to having careers. This lack of, childbearing in women caused endometriosis. Also, this is echoing the Hippocratic corpus, a text that was written 1,500 years earlier between, sort of 5th and 3rd BCE. So I'm particularly interested in the trajectory of medical treatises into present day myths. And this is something that having Dr. Ravinda on my supervisory team is that maybe she's gonna help me differentiate these myths and facts, and I can kind of keep the myths separate from how I go about mitigating with participants, I think, because I don't think that would be helpful for them to be told yet more myths. So like these treatises and medical records are like all about the UK, in Wellcome Collection, the Royal College of Physicians Museum, British Library, Surgery Hall, both in Edinburgh and London, and even into like small borough councils and museums like Walsall Local History Centre and the Leather Museum. Some of which I also know the collections through my work as an art handler. So when I was researching for why these huge delayed diagnoses for endometriosis exist, I learned of a concept for philosophy, which really helped me understand what happened to my own experiences in healthcare. And this is a term called testimonial injustice. And it's an injustice related to knowledge. So this kind of uh one of the important things that makes us human is our ability to produce knowledge and to be able to tell it to someone and then be listened to and be heard. And, when we can't do that, we can't produce knowledge and we're not listened to. And we experience an injustice. We experience an epistemic injustice, which means an injustice related to knowledge. It dehumanizes us and we can't pass the knowledge on in instance of my mom not being able to tell me it's endometriosis because she didn't know. So this type of epistemic injustice was coined by Miranda Fricker in, I think, 2007 or 8, who's a British theorist, and um, she says, I've got a quote here actually. Testimonial injustice occurs when a person's voice or knowledge is discounted, dismissed due to prejudice from the listener about their social identity. So, it basically means that um, how someone from, different groups of people, due to stereotypes about their identity, are less likely to be listened to and believed by others. This isn't just doctors, but, by others. And they're viewed as being like less trustworthy or knowledgeable in what they say. And they're more likely to be like have their accounts doubted. Um, and then, this is known as like a credibility deficit. Um, so yes, that's something that I'm applying to my research at the moment. Moving on, I wanted to mention about the uh, medical workforce, sorry, and talk about witches because women have been healers for a really long time, and sexism in the medical workforce has huge impacts on patient care even now. Medical care historically has been provided by female healers and midwives within their communities who provided medical, you know, herbal remedies and also delivered babies. And these remedies were handed down through generations of family, kind of like oral histories. Um, and here on the left, we have an image of uh, the work by, this is an illustration by a woman called Trot who was from South Italy. She lived in the 11th century. And she wrote the Trotula, which is three books that basically looks at the symptoms and treatments of women's illnesses. And this became really popular and widely used throughout the Middle Ages. And she suggested really, practical, humane treatments to helping women, to help them and not punish them for being ill. So, like, kind of despite this really early advance, by the 14th century, women physicians were kind of like prohibited from practicing across Europe. And this kind of early kind of women training as doctors or practicing as doctors was abolished as the Middle Ages went on. And midwives started to be blamed for, poor health outcomes, so that childbirth can be dangerous, particularly in the Middle Ages before we had good health care and, there were plagues all about the place. By the 15th century, midwives started to be blamed for all of, sort of this death and lack of life on behalf of like baby and mom, instead of seeing it as like a natural occurrence. They're accused of being, possessed by the devil, slaughtering innocents, and then, we're at the height of the European witch trials, which, we know like around 80% of were women who were trialed and aged more than 40. So maybe they'd gone through this process of childbirth and now they're not useful and they're discarded. Sylvia Federici also talks about this in Caliban and the Witch. Um, so it's, a lot of these midwives and healers who were deemed to be witches, you know, they were then executed. Um, and the I want to talk about this quote. The historian and writer Eleanor Clegorn describes the motivations behind this as being complicated collusions of religious, social, and political and economic forces. And she kind of says that, the anxieties about the influence of dark magic, sorcery, and demonology were so rife across the continent that had been so horribly decimated by disease, upheaval, and unrest that the witch hunts and trials where women, especially those who were unmarried, older, poor, involving in healing or practicing midwifery, were maliciously scapegoated as the vectors of death and destruction. So in this way, women were actively marginalized and actively removed from the practice of medicine. Medicine started to be professionalized in the 19th century, so there's a real proliferation of scientific advances which made medicine more efficient and more effective. So, for example, standardized medical examinations, new tools, new, the acceptance of germ theory. they started to, use anesthetics and anesthetic techniques. And, all those traditional healing methods that women were practicing for this, were abandoned to make way for this kind of like new technology. Um, yeah, and at that time, kind of male doctors wanted to differentiate from themselves, from the quacks, the midwives, the traditional healers. They started to be like regulated, So in the 50s, medical acts were introduced to regulate qualifications of doctors, and such regulations, they disqualified women. I'd like to talk about this book, Women and Their Bodies, um, which, became, sorry, it's Our Bodies, Ourselves. It was published in the 70s, and it was, sort of self-published, and it was really a revolutionary book at the time because it talked frankly about sexuality and abortion, and it put women's health in the context of politics and what was going on in that time. And, unsurprisingly, the book became a massive success. It became really popular and then started to be published by large publishers. And it's still available today, actually, in like new updated editions. So I've actually got a copy on order. And I think it's a good example of how women get together and they speak up about their experiences of healthcare and the discrimination they've had, and they share it, whether that's in person, through artworks, essays, podcasts, films, podcasts. I said podcasts, sorry. Chat rooms, documentaries. There's such power in women sharing their experiences. It raises awareness and it creates knowledge. And it also can be a really reciprocal thing to do, and a powerful thing to do to revisit trauma to help others. And what I think is like very cool also, is an act of defiance against power structures that, have historically and have always wanted to silence women. So, great history of women working as activists to really change healthcare provisions. This is from the Wellcome collection and it's named Disease Women. I saw this while I was working there. Um, so this is from Medieval Women at British Library. So around 1420 from Germany. Most medieval and early modern medical diagrams depicted the male figure, and this is still the case today, as such with defibrillators in public areas intended for a member of the public to use in the event of a cardiac arrest. The models are still displayed without breasts, so that may be evidence why women are statistically twice as likely to die from a heart attack than men in the UK still today. This isn't the only reason, of course, as women are 4 times more likely to, be prescribed with anti-anxiety medication than men, for the heart attack that they are actually having. Relating back to this image, although the depiction of diseased woman was intended as a basic teaching guide, the diaphragm like really reinforces the idea of the female body as inherently predisposed to disease, and it's therefore faulty. When we think about medicine, we expect it as a science to be impartial and to be fair. And when we're patients, we want our doctors to listen to us and care for us as, humans, human beings. But, the history of medicine, as well as a scientific history, is one that's deeply linked to social and cultural like issues. We still live in a patriarchal society, and male dominance is ingrained in medicine. And, medical research continues to reflect that. and this affects the medical knowledge that we have today. I think that iterated through everything I've just spoken about, there's a real prevalence of documenting the current medical challenges of that time, everything from malpractice to injustice, negligence, and gaslighting. Although this research, I'm keen to document, the current gynecology crisis as a recorded moment in history through women's stories and accounts. I'm aware this is already being done through newspapers and media somewhat, although I'd argue it's not in an ethical way. What isn't being done and what doesn't exist is supportive environments for those stories being told. And in, my proposal, that's through the iterances and um, utilization of workshops, of artist workshops. So an experience I had about unethical, reporting was when I wrote an article about my experiences with for endometriosis for the Birmingham Live, which was during March, which is Awareness Month. My story ended up being republished by like MSN, The Mirror, The Wales Online, BBC, Liverpool Echo, and even the Daily Mail, completely without my consent. I didn't want to be associated with newspapers like that, and now my words are being used by right-wing conglomerates that hatefully hold online comments by the sorts of people who read that newspaper. You know, I asked for any money raised by my story to be diagnosed to Endometriosis UK to find out 6 months later that that never happened, still ongoing. But I'm also, this has made me critically aware of people's data and my intent behind my research. I'd say that I'm incapable as an empathetic person, of like committing, the atrocities of the Daily Mail, it is clear my ethics behind my research. I'm noticing a gap in knowledge and practice of supporting those with endometriosis awaiting the healthcare, diagnosis and treatment. A gap in support for those in general with endometriosis, and I want to fill that through, an engaging arts practice. This brings me on to the ethics of my research. Um, in my case, having my information shared in the way that it was, it felt really extractionary, like something was taken away from me in the sense, like my informational, my personal details, they were all shared without my consent. And these are important lessons that I learned from this experience that I'll center my ethics of my research around, such as making the right to withdraw a valid and clear option from the very start, so that any participants I work with are in full knowledge of any data or personal information I have about them, such as, both sharing the exact same files so that the individual can query, withdraw, or edit the same files as me. They can completely withdraw from any part of the process and take their data with them. you know, each participation, each participant, can have their own individual separate folder within the hard drive, and it's each protected with its own unique password to ensure confidentiality between participants. Any personal data on the external hard drive with passport password protection. Luckily for me, my partner works in cybersecurity, so I have the very best advice how to implement these methods onto my data management plan. And I'll, of course, destroy the hard drive once the PhD is complete, and my participants will know this. So going back to my statement about my information feeling extractionary, this isn't about how my data was shared to the whole internet, but in the way that it was very transactional. It was very one way. I didn't gain anything from this experience. And I'm adamant that this isn't going to be something my participants will feel about our working relationship. And I think a way that I can do that is by using artist workshops, by establishing an environment that isn't putting a person on the spot and expecting them to talk about their entire medical trauma. You know, I'm aware and conscious to not inflict my own experiences onto that of my participants, you know, although I doubt it. Some people may genuinely have really great accounts of endometriosis care, and that needs to be part of the history that I write to. Um, yeah. So I'd like to talk about uh collaborative autoethnography. And that's a social version of auto theory. It involves, you know, researchers pooling their stories to find some commonalities and differences, and then exploring these stories to discover meanings of the stories in the relationships to the social, cultural um, contexts. So this is exactly what I'm trying to do with my research and engaging with participants from Endometriosis UK. It's not about telling stories and asking, you know, what do they mean to me or to us. This is about like questioning and reflecting to understand what it might tell us about the wider context. You know, this being the implications of women accessing healthcare and finding inaccessibility within that when trying to forge new and better and supportive environments for those with endometriosis awaiting healthcare. So I'm aware that my research isn't just about my story or our stories. You know, we are sort of the data and we provide some kind of analytical lens, in Briolt's term. You know, we were the site of the research, but still the research needs to connect and help us and others learn about the wider issues. So this is also why arts practice can be a great mitigator of communicating these wider issues, because for a lot, you know, a lot of people, medical research is inaccessible. It's inaccessible to me. We don't have the language or the knowledge to understand this data. So what might, you know, we might understand are different assemblages of research materials that communicate, you know, with others to narrate an issue. So what I anticipate is like at the beginning of the PhD, I will be um, going to archives and conducting kind of primary research. I will start to forge relationships with participants from Endometriosis UK. I already have a good um, relationship with Endometriosis UK because I've done some participatory um, works and studies with them in the past, and I've accessed their support for the last 5 years with regards to my disease. Um, so there's going to be, you know, an area or an aspect of forging new relationships and gaining comfortability with each other. Maybe it is that I start then taking some of the group to archive visits or exhibitions with me, and we start to have conversations about how we respond to some of these themes or um, you know, key research materials that I'm finding. Um, and then I think we will see how we respond to that. You know, this could be through that we make physical artwork together. It could be that we make podcasts together or we write together. I'm really unsure how that's going to manifest because, again, like I said with my other workshops, it's really about, for me, being responsive in that moment with that group. So it's really going to be shaped around, you know, what my participants want to do, what they feel resonates with their experiences. Um, and yeah, I think that's as much as I know now. I think in my thesis, I will reflect on some of the artworks that I wrote in my proposal. I do have experience of writing kind of professionally outside of academia. Anyway, I've published with AN as thesis, done some blogs for Icon Gallery and Compton Verney on their exhibitions as well. So I feel like that is something that's completely within my wheelhouse to write sort of critically and analytically. Um, Possible pros of the research is that I would hope that this would help institutions foster better ways of supporting women with endometriosis. I would hope that the participants that come find solidarity with other people with the disease. I do know some people that don't know anyone with endometriosis other than me, whereas I personally know sort of between 10 and 12 individuals with it. I have 10 to 12 friends who have endometriosis. And that's generally about me kind of being a bit of an advocator and trying to raise awareness of it as well. So the pros are that it's responsive and helpful to the people who access me. Um, Possible pros to me is that um, I start to think, or I'm more critical of the ways, like the different methodologies that I apply. It could be that I think one methodology will work, and then through working with the participants, that doesn't work, and I'll have to rethink it. So it's going to enable me to be more reflexive to others as well. So the possible difficulties I think that I might encounter is that I suppose I could need a counselor or some kind of therapist for the sessions, and thinking logistically what I can support my participants. If someone really needs complex emotional support, I'm fully aware of the limitations of what I can offer. So I think, applying for some separate funding to be able to hire a counsellor, someone who is specialised to dealing with trauma and response, I think that could be like really doable. Um, I am currently training to be a death midwife, which is someone who is with a person, with a client it could be any time from diagnosis of a terminal illness to, after they die. And it's really about supporting the individual with death and the family. So I do have some training, but like I said, still I am still training. Um, I'm in the early stages of doing that, but I do have sort of an ecology around me of trained death workers who are they do that full time. This has been their practice for a long time, and they support other people learning. So I think I do have some access to sort of finding a suitable counselor. It's about kind of like writing a funding bid to be able to pay for someone in those sessions that I'd really need to think about. Um, And to think about back to Grace Dorito, I went to her one of her sessions. It was an artist workshop, and it was writing a letter to grief. And she actually had a bereavement counselor there, and that bereavement counselor was how I started to find out about being a death midwife. Um, so there's an interesting little circle going on here. Some other possible difficulties I might encounter is trying to access or trying to gain, um, permission for sharing data about both my participants and archival materials from the institutions that I work at. With regards to my participants, I can always make that paramount that they can withdraw at any time. And in them giving me permission to share, I'm always going to check with them what it is that I'm sharing, that they're happy with that. Um, and the other thing with gaining access or permission to share from institutions, that is going to have to be something that I just mitigate with the institution as I go along, depending on what archive I'm in. Um, so I think that's something that BCU can also support me in sort of writing requests for doing that. That's, like kind of within my work as an art handler, although I work a lot with archives, I've not been on the other end of it where I've seen loans go out, like various insurances and PLI insurances, I'm aware of, but I don't know how exactly that's done. So my supervisor, Dr. Chris Latauris from UOB, this is something that he does a lot in his practice. Um, so that was another aspect of why I asked him to be a supervisor, because he's really going to support me being able to do that. Seeing someone established do that is going to help me do that. Um, Skills that I have. So yeah, I have written outside of academia, through AN and, the various blogs that I've spoken about. Um, that is that is something that I can really bring in to writing my thesis, and maybe even sort of the language that I use, written communication with my participants to ask for permission. And, I'm quite good at communication, so, that will help. Um, yeah, and then I've kind of like spoke about why I need the supervisors that I do. Um, and that's like, UOB has got such a great collection through the Cadbury Research Centre, through the Shakespeare Institute, through uh, the Barber. There's great faculties there that I can access in having Chris as um, like my second supervisor. Um, we know each other relatively well, and our research, and there's a lot of overlaps in terms of like the witches and injustice of women and women's history. So I think that's really going to be enriched by having Chris there, as well as those institutions. With BCU, with, my main supervisor, Catherine Baker, having the material research clusters at BCU, and it's a university that I'm really familiar with. I have great support there from, academic workers. Um, so, that's something that I'm really grateful, and it enables me to have a practice-based PhD as well. And then also with Uni of Nottingham, there's a great biomedicine department. And, having Dr. Ravinder, who's a reproductive physiologist. Um, it's really going to help me separate like the almost like speculative aspects of like my history side, and, really think about how it is that I go about divulging information and engaging with my participants within my arts practice as well. Like, separating the myths from the facts, and knowing, you know, for sure what is what when I'm working with my participants as well. Thank you.